The deafening roar of the Danube River crashes against wooden piles, drowning out the shouts of men. Thud, thud, thud. It is the rhythmic sound of Roman engineering driving massive oak stakes into the rushing water, the sound of a barrier no man was supposed to cross until the legions arrived. In 106 CE, Rome did not just win a war, they hijacked an entire economy. When the dust settled, Emperor Trajan brought home a staggering 165,000 kilograms of gold and 331,000 kilograms of silver. It was a treasure haul so massive that it allowed the empire to abolish all taxes for a full year and fund the construction of the forum that still stands in the capital today. But to secure this fortune, the legions had to march into a nightmare. They faced an enemy that did not fear death, wielding a weapon known as the falx, one which was so terrifying that for the first time in history, the Roman heavy infantry had to redesign their helmets and armor just to survive a single blow. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we march to the edge of the known world to witness the absolute zenith of Roman power, the Dacian Wars. But before the gold and the glory, there was a deep, festering shame in the heart of the empire. Rome was not used to looking across a border with fear, but the Danube frontier was different. For years, a shadow had been growing in the Carpathian Mountains, a kingdom that did not just resist Roman power, but mocked it. The Dacians, led by their cunning King Decebalus, had achieved something the fragmented Germanic tribes never could: unity. Decebalus was not merely a tribal warlord. He was a sophisticated monarch who welcomed Roman deserters, learned their engineering secrets, and drilled his warriors with a discipline that rivaled the legions themselves. But what truly stung the pride of the Senate was the shameful legacy of Emperor Domitian. After a disastrous defeat years prior, where a Roman standard was captured, Rome had been forced into a humiliating arrangement. To keep the peace, the empire was actually paying annual subsidies to Decebalus. Imagine the scene in the capital: Roman gold, minted with the face of the emperor, being loaded onto wagons and sent north to buy off a barbarian king. The clinking of those coins as they were handed over to Dacian envoys was the sound of Roman honor bleeding away. This tribute was a festering wound in the Roman psyche, but the problem was not just pride, it was survival. The Roman economy was stagnating, its currency debased, and its treasury emptying, while across the river, the Dacian mountains were rumored to be bursting with gold and silver mines. It was a paradox that could not stand. A struggling empire paying protection money to a wealthy enemy. The tactical situation was equally grim. The Dacians were masters of their terrain, fighting from stone fortresses perched high in the Oresti Mountains, a natural citadel that rendered the traditional open-field dominance of the Roman heavy infantry almost useless. To break this deadlock, Rome did not need another politician in the Senate House. It needed a sword. In 98 CE, the elderly Emperor Nerva died, and the purple fell to a man who had spent his life not in the marble halls of the capital, but in the mud of the frontier camps. His name was Marcus Ulpius Traianus, and he would not be sending gold to the north any longer. He would be coming to take it back. Trajan was not a man of silk robes and whispered court intrigues. He was a creature of the camp, a soldier emperor who marched on foot alongside his men and shared their rations of salt pork and sour wine. When he looked north across the Danube, he did not see a diplomatic problem to be managed, but a military objective to be crushed. The mobilization he ordered was nothing short of a continental shift in gravity. From the burning sands of Syria to the rainy garrisons of Britannia, the orders went out, and the eagles began to move. In total, Trajan stripped the frontiers of the empire to assemble 13 full legions supported by countless auxiliary cohorts. It was a force of over 100,000 men, with some historians estimating up to 150,000, marking the largest single army Rome had fielded since the civil wars of Augustus. This was not a border raid. It was a migration of iron. But the legionaries marching toward Dacia carried a quiet dread in their hearts, a fear whispered around the campfires by veterans of previous failed wars. The Dacians possessed a weapon that defied the standard Roman defensive doctrine, the falx. This was a two-handed, sickle-like sword with a blade curving inward, wielded with terrifying force. For centuries, the Roman scutum, the large rectangular shield, had been impenetrable, allowing the legionary to fight safely from behind a wall of wood and leather. The falx changed everything. Its hooked blade could reach over the top of the shield to strike the soldier's head, or worse, its sheer kinetic energy could split a shield in half and sever the arm holding it. The archaeological record tells a grim story of severed limbs and cleaved helmets from this period. Faced with this mechanical slaughter, the Roman military machine did what it did best. It adapted with ruthless pragmatism. In the months before the invasion, field smithies rang with the sound of hammers day and night. For the first time, legionaries were issued the manica, a segmented metal arm guard previously used only by gladiators to protect their exposed right arms. Helmets were reinforced with heavy iron crossbars riveted across the skull to prevent the falx from slicing through to the brain. Trajan was not just sending men to die, he was engineering their survival. As the year 101 CE approached, the preparations were complete. The legions had cut a road directly into the sheer rock cliffs of the Danube Gorge, a feat of engineering that declared their intent to stay. The machine was ready, the armor was hardened, and the emperor was at the front. But Decebalus was not waiting in the open field where the Romans were strongest. He had turned his mountains into a fortress of stone and death, and he was watching the river. In the spring of 101 CE, the order was given. The Roman offensive began not with a charge, but with a feat of engineering that stunned the ancient world. A massive pontoon bridge spanning the Danube, lashed together by the genius of the architect Apollodorus. Tens of thousands of legionaries poured across the river, their hobnailed sandals thundering on the wooden planks, marching straight into the throat of the Carpathian Mountains. But as the column snaked its way toward the Iron Gates Pass, the sky turned black. The Roman chroniclers and the relief carvings on Trajan's column suggest that the Battle of Tapai was fought not just against the Dacians, but against the fury of the elements themselves. As the two massive hosts collided in the narrow pass, a violent thunderstorm erupted, turning the battlefield into a slick, muddy slaughterhouse where footing was as deadly as the enemy. The fighting at Tapai was a brutal, grinding slugfest that stripped away the tactical elegance of the Roman cohort. In the driving rain and dense forest, the rigid, disciplined lines of the legions dissolved into a series of desperate, bloody brawls. Here, the terrifying power of the falx was fully realized. The Dacian warriors, charging downhill with the momentum of the storm, crashed into the Roman shield wall. The sound of iron shearing through wood and bone echoed through the valley as the curved blades hooked over shields, pulling centurions out of formation to be hacked apart. The Romans held their ground only through sheer grit and the superior quality of their armor, their reinforced helmets ringing like bells under the relentless blows. It was a victory, but the cost was catastrophic. The casualty lists were so long that, according to the historian Cassius Dio, Trajan himself ran out of bandages for his men. In a gesture that cemented his legend, the emperor reportedly tore his own imperial robes into strips to bind the wounds of his soldiers. Though the Romans held the field, the Dacian army had not been destroyed. It had merely melted back into the mist and the mountains. Although the winter brought a halt to the advance, and Decebalus, realizing he could not defeat the full weight of Rome in a head-on collision yet, launched a diversionary raid across the frozen Danube into the Roman province of Moesia to the east. Trajan was forced to pivot, marching his exhausted troops through the snow to crush this new threat. By 102 CE, battered and seeing his fortresses under siege, Decebalus finally sued for peace. He came before Trajan, bowing low, agreeing to surrender his siege engines, hand over Roman deserters, and demolish his fortifications. Trajan accepted the surrender, believing he had tamed the wolf at the border. He was wrong. Decebalus was merely buying time, sharpening his claws for a betrayal that would shock the empire. The peace treaty of 102 CE was merely ink on parchment. But what Trajan built next was carved in stone and bound in iron. To ensure the Dacians could never again hide behind the natural moat of the Danube, the emperor summoned the greatest architect of the age, Apollodorus of Damascus. His task was impossible: to span the violent, churning waters of the lower Danube, a river so wide and deep it was considered untamable. Yet, under the architect's command, the legionaries became laborers, and the frontier echoed not with the clash of swords, but with the rhythmic, deafening pounding of pile drivers. Day and night, the air was thick with the acrid smell of hot pitch and the dust of quarried stone, as massive oak piles were driven deep into the riverbed to support 20 huge masonry piers. The result was the bridge at Drabeta, a marvel that defied nature itself. On stretching 1,135 meters across the water, it stood as the longest arch bridge in the world and would hold that title for more than 1,000 years. It was a masterpiece of logistics, featuring a wooden superstructure resting on pillars of brick and mortar that rose 19 meters above the waterline. But to the Dacian scouts watching from the far bank, this was not just a bridge. It was a psychological weapon of terrifying clarity. It sent a message louder than any trumpet. The river could no longer save them. Rome had conquered the water, and the legions could now march dry-shod into the heart of Dacia at will. The Danube was no longer a barrier. It was a Roman highway. With the final beam secured, the trap was set. So when King Decebalus, unable to bear the humiliation of servitude, broke the treaty in 105 CE and attacked Roman garrisons, the Trajan did not just mobilize for another punitive raid. He marched back across his bridge with a darker purpose. This time, he was not coming to negotiate. He was coming to erase Dacia from the map. The truce shattered not with a battle, but with a crime against honor that would seal the fate of a nation. In 105 CE, realizing that his forces could not withstand another open collision with the legions, King Decebalus resorted to treachery. Under the guise of a diplomatic parley, he captured the Roman commander Gnaeus Pompeius Longinus, a distinguished general and a personal friend of the emperor. Decebalus believed he held a MasterCard. He demanded that Trajan evacuate all Roman territories north of the Danube and pay massive reparations in exchange for Longinus's life. It was a ransom demand that struck at the very heart of Roman dignity. But the Dacian king did not understand the Roman concept of virtue. Longinus, refusing to be the shackle that held back the empire's vengeance, deceived his captors to smuggle a message out to Trajan, urging him to attack without mercy. Then, obtaining a vial of poison from a freedman, the commander drank it in his cell, choosing death over leverage. When news of Longinus's suicide reached the Roman camp, the mood shifted instantly from strategic calculation to cold, exterminating fury. Trajan did not just declare war. He declared a manhunt. The Senate in Rome usually divided by factional squabbling, united in their outrage, and the full military might of the empire was unleashed. In the spring of 106 CE, the legions crossed Apollodorus's bridge, not as conquerors seeking tribute, but as executioners. This was a war of annihilation. Trajan divided his massive host, now numbering nearly a third of the empire's entire military strength, into multiple columns that swept through the Carpathian passes like a tightening noose. They burned villages, enslaved the populace, and dismantled every fortification in their path, leaving nothing behind but smoke and silence. The advance was methodical and terrifyingly slow. The Romans did not rush. They built roads as they marched, turning the wild forests into a grid of Roman order. One by one, the outer defensive rings of the Dacian kingdom collapsed under the weight of Roman siege engines and the discipline of the heavy infantry. The legionaries, their helmets now scarred from previous battles, fought with a grim efficiency, offering no quarter to the warriors who had humiliated them years before. By early summer, the mountains had been pacified, the passes secured, and the trap had snapped shut. The 100,000-strong Roman host now stood in the shadow of the Oresti Mountains, looking up at the final prize, the spiritual and political heart of Dacia, the impregnable fortress city of Sarmizegetusa Regia. Sarmizegetusa Regia was not merely a fortress, it was a sanctuary carved into the roof of the world, sitting 1,200 meters above sea level in the dense Oresti Mountains. For the Roman legionaries, merely reaching the walls was a feat of endurance, dragging tons of siege equipment up steep forested slopes where the air grew thin and cold. But once the artillery was set, the judgment of Jupiter began. The silence of the sacred mountain was shattered by the deafening rhythmic thwack of Roman ballistae and scorpions. These torsion-powered machines unleashed a relentless storm of iron-tipped bolts and stones, hammering the Dacian limestone walls with a precision that turned the defenders' ramparts into a kill zone. Archaeological evidence from the site shows walls pockmarked by heavy impacts, a testament to the sheer kinetic violence the Romans brought to bear. Yet, despite the bombardment, the Dacian capital held. Its thick Murus Dacicus walls, a unique construction of stone blocks reinforced with timber beams, absorbed the shock of the battering rams. Trajan, observing from his command tent, realized that a direct assault up the steep slopes would cost thousands of lives. So, while the emperor turned to the weapon that had built the empire, engineering. Roman sappers, likely guided by a trader from within the city, located the terracotta pipes that channeled water from a nearby spring into the fortress. With ruthless efficiency, the legionaries severed the aqueduct. Inside the walls, as the cisterns ran dry and the thirst set in, the defenders faced a grim choice: die of dehydration or face the Roman gladius. The end of Sarmizegetusa Regia was not a surrender, it was a funeral pyre. Realizing the city was lost, the Dacian nobility gathered in the sacred precincts. They did not open the gates to beg for mercy. Instead, they set their own capital on fire. As the Romans breached the perimeter in a disciplined testudo formation, they were met not just by desperate warriors, but by a wall of heat and smoke, as the legionaries fought room to room, temple to temple, choking on the ash of a burning civilization. Inside the royal palace, many Dacian nobles chose to drink hemlock from a massive communal vessel, rather than be paraded in a Roman triumph. The screaming of the dying city echoed through the valleys, marking the death of an independent Dacia. But when the smoke cleared and the legionaries finally secured the smoldering ruins of the treasury, they found it empty. The city was taken, but the king was gone. Decebalus had slipped away into the wilderness, taking the secret of his massive treasure with him. The hunt was on. The fall of the capital did not end the war. It only began the final hunt. Decebalus, the king who had defied Rome for nearly 2 decades, had vanished into the dense ancient forests of the Carpathians, intent on rallying the scattered remnants of his army for a guerrilla war. But Trajan had anticipated this. He unleashed the Alli, elite auxiliary cavalry units specialized in tracking and rapid pursuit. Among them rode a decurion named Tiberius Claudius Maximus, a veteran soldier whose tombstone, discovered centuries later in Greece, vividly depicts the final moments of this manhunt. The chase was relentless, a thundering pursuit through the winding mountain paths where the sound of Roman hooves drowned out the wind in the pines. The legionaries were not just hunting a man, they were hunting a symbol. As long as Decebalus drew breath, Dacia would never truly submit. Cornered in a thicket, cut off from his bodyguards and surrounded by the ring of Roman steel, Decebalus faced the grim reality of Roman justice, and he knew exactly what awaited him in the capital. Chains, a humiliating walk through the Forum in Trajan's triumph, and an ignoble death by strangulation at the Gemonian stairs. In a final act of defiance, the Dacian king chose to deny Rome its ultimate trophy. As Maximus charged forward to take him alive, Decebalus drew his sica, a curved Dacian dagger, and in one swift, brutal motion slashed his own throat. When the Roman officer arrived, the king was already dying, his blood soaking into the soil he had fought to defend. Maximus severed the king's head and right hand, delivering them to Trajan as grim proof that the war was over. The head was later thrown down the stairs in Rome, a gruesome period to a sentence written in blood. But the Romans were not just after the king, they were after the gold that had funded his defiance. Under torture, a captured Dacian confidant named Bacillus revealed a secret that seemed almost mythical. Before the siege, Decebalus had used Roman prisoners to divert the course of the Sarmizegetusa River, buried his vast treasury in the dry riverbed, and then turned the waters back over the hiding spot. The Romans, masters of hydraulic engineering themselves, promptly diverted the river once more. What they found in the mud staggered the ancient world. It was not just a chest or two. It was a hoard estimated at 165,000 kilograms of gold and 331,000 kilograms of silver. The influx of wealth was so massive, it caused a drop in the value of gold across the entire Mediterranean. Decebalus was dead, and his kingdom was erased. But his gold would now pay for the greatest celebration in Roman history, a spectacle of victory that would last for months. Trajan returned to Rome not merely as a conqueror, but as the architect of a new golden age. The triumph that followed was a spectacle of excess that the world had never seen and would never see again. For 123 days, the Colosseum roared with the sound of steel and death as 10,000 gladiators fought in the arena, and 11,000 wild beasts were slaughtered to entertain the mob. The influx of Dacian gold was so immense that Trajan abolished all direct taxation for the year, a feat of economic power that cemented his title as Optimus Princeps, the best of emperors. With this blood-soaked wealth, he transformed the capital, carving out the massive Forum of Trajan. At its center, he raised a monument that has outlasted the empire itself, Trajan's Column. On this spiraling frieze of marble is a motion picture in stone, detailing the bridge, the siege, the reign at Tapai, and the suicide of Decebalus, preserving the faces of the legionaries who marched into the mountains so that they might never be forgotten. Yet, history is often written with a cruel sense of irony. The conquest of Dacia marked the absolute territorial zenith of the Roman Empire, the high water mark of its power. Rome would never be larger, richer, or more feared than it was in this moment. But Dacia, the last province to be added, was also the first to be lost. The very salient that projected Roman power deep into barbarian lands proved impossible to defend as the centuries wore on and the frontiers began to burn. In 271 CE, under the Emperor Aurelian, the legions were forced to withdraw, abandoning the mines and the cities to the encroaching darkness. The bridge of Apollodorus was dismantled to prevent enemies from using it, and the province of Dacia Felix slipped back into the mists of history. Today, the empire has turned to dust, but the column still stands in Rome, a silent sentinel. Its stone reliefs remind us that the peak of glory is often just a step away from the beginning of the fall. If you want to join us as we explore the next chapter of history's greatest powers, please subscribe to our channel to relive these heroic chapters with us.